Isaac Newton spent his life unlocking the laws of physics, right? I mean, everyone knows about the apple and gravity.
Right, the absolute basics of modern science.
Yeah, but what a lot of people don't know is that he actually spent 30 years trying to decode this hidden mathematical countdown clock in the Bible.
And he died thinking he'd completely failed.
Exactly. He thought he missed it. But today, we are looking at the modern software that claims to have finally, cracked his code.
It is a massive intellectual leap. I mean,
Mhm.
we're looking at historical text today, not as literature or mythology, but as an encrypted chronological system.
Right.
Newton suspected the code was there, but he was essentially trying to navigate a website's source code using a manual typewriter. He had the genius, sure, but he lacked the operating system required to run the simulation.
That's such a good way to put it. So welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. For you listening, our mission today is to explore a fascinating and, well, highly unusual mathematical audit of the biblical timeline.
Yeah, we are unpacking a book called God's Guide to the Galaxy, When Singularity Merges with Salvation by J.P. Grizzle.
And what makes this so compelling is the author's background. He's not a theologian. He is an airline transport pilot and a welder.
Which completely changes the perspective.
Totally. He looks at the world through the lens of structural integrity, instrument panels, and rigid physics. And he uses modern astronomical data, specifically NASA's JPL Horizons and Stellarium software, to map out this literal countdown clock.
And to be super clear for you listening, before we really get into the weeds of this timeline, our goal today isn't to declare that the world ends on a specific Sunday in the near future.
Right. No date setting from us.
Exactly. Or to push any kind of religious or political ideology. We are strictly here to map out the sheer scale of the intellectual architecture this author has built based on the source material. We're examining the math and the physics of his hypothesis, not, preaching a sermon.
Exactly. Think of us as impartial engineers inspecting a really elaborate blueprint. Because
Yeah.
reading this book, it feels like watching someone reverse engineer a massive piece of legacy software just to find a hidden developer's log.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with Newton. Why does Grizzle argue that the guy who figured out gravity couldn't figure out this timeline?
Well, Grizzle argues Newton was missing three specific keys that only modern computing could provide. He needed a celestial anchor, a precise year length, and a continuous verification protocol.
Okay.
See, the author treats the biblical text as a rigid ternary constraint system. It's entirely about counting days, not calendar labels.
Because calendars change.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly. Calendar labels change depending on who is in power, emperors, popes, but days are absolute.
Okay. I follow the need for a celestial anchor because if you're counting absolute days, you have to know exactly where day zero, or the starting line, actually is. So where does he find that?
He finds it in the book of Revelation, chapter 12.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it describes a woman clothed with the sun, the moon at her feet, and a crown of 12 stars. Now, for centuries, people read that as just pure poetic symbolism.
Sure, it sounds very metaphorical.
But Grizzle plugs those exact parameters into modern astronomy software. And what he finds is that it perfectly describes an exact, verifiable celestial alignment.
Wow. What was the alignment?
It's the constellation Virgo, the moon, the constellation Leo, and Jupiter. And that precise visual alignment occurred in a very specific window, September 11th, 3 BCE.
So he's saying Revelation isn't a metaphor at all. It's literally a set of GPS coordinates for time.
Exactly.
But okay, if that's the anchor, what's the ruler? Because if we're counting exact days across thousands of years, wouldn't a single leap year error or, like you said, a medieval pope changing the calendar just completely ruin the calculation?
It absolutely would.
So how does he prove the math hasn't drifted?
That is where the second and third keys come in. The ruler he uses isn't the Gregorian calendar. It's the true solar precision time year.
Which is what, exactly?
It's exactly 365.2421896,698 days.
Whoa. Down to the decimal.
Right. It's the physical rotation of the Earth. And to prove it hasn't drifted, he introduces the checksum. In computer science, a checksum is a function that verifies data integrity. Grizzle uses modulo 7 arithmetic.
Wait, break down modulo 7 for me. I know it's a math term, but how does that actually verify a date from, thousands of years ago?
It's surprisingly elegant, actually. Modulo math is about dividing numbers and only looking at the remainder. So modulo 7 focuses on the 7-day weekly cycle.
Okay.
If you take a massive number of days between two historical events and divide that number by 7, The remainder tells you what day of the week it is.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and Grisel argues that the 7-day weekly cycle has never, ever drifted in human history. So if his mathematical formula says a specific event 4,000 years ago happened on a Sunday, the modulus 7 math has to perfectly align with the unbroken Sunday to Saturday cycle you and I are experiencing this exact week.
That's wild. So if it's off by a single decimal point,
The entire timeline collapses. It's completely unforgiving.
it's an all or nothing equation. And he tracks all of this using what he calls the fall day number, or FDN, right?
Yep, the FDN.
Imagine you're looking at a system log on your computer, and it just counts upwards from the second you turn the machine on. That's the FDN. It's a continuous count starting from FDN 1, which Grisel calculates as the exact day Adam entered mortality.
But to get to FDN1, you actually have to boot up the system first.
Right, the creation week.
Exactly. We have to rewind to Genesis. And true to his background, Grisel doesn't read Genesis as a Sunday school story. He translates it into hardcore, observable scientific concepts.
This was honestly my favorite part of the source material. So, let there be light on day 1, which he calculates as Sunday, September 6, 4004 BCE, isn't just a deity flipping a giant light switch.
No, not at all.
He argues it is the installation of the speed of light, the actual physical constant c.
Precisely. From a physics standpoint, he aligns day 1 with quantum decoherence.
Quantum decoherence.
Yeah. Before this moment, the universe is just a state of probabilities. By introducing light, you introduce measurability. The wave function collapses into a definite state. Space and time officially begin.
That is so cool. And then on day 2, God creates the firmament to separate the waters. Now, a lot of ancient historians picture this as like a literal solid dome over the earth.
Right, like a snow globe.
Yeah, exactly. But Grisel, wearing his engineer and pilot hats, identifies this as a structural pressure differential. It's the atmosphere. And to explain why atmospheric boundaries are so critical, he shares this absolutely terrifying story from his aviation career.
Oh man, yes, the icing incident over Denver.
Right. So imagine you are flying a twin Comanche airplane at 21,000 feet right into the teeth of a massive ice storm.
Sounds like a nightmare.
It gets worse. The plane's heater completely breaks. It drops to -5 degrees inside the cabin. The windshield is iced over from the inside just from the pilot's own breath. And his throttles are literally frozen solid. He can't move them. His only option to survive is to use the natural boundaries of high and low pressure air, dropping altitude to find warmer air to melt the ice before the plane just, falls out of the sky.
It's such a visceral story. And it perfectly illustrates his architectural point. Boundaries like the atmospheric firmament are life-saving, load-bearing structures.
Yeah.
They aren't just pretty scenery for humans to look at. They are the physical infrastructure that prevents the entire system from vaporizing or freezing solid.
And once the infrastructure is built, the system needs its operating protocols, right? So on days 3 and 4, vegetation appears, which Grisel describes as DNA recursion.
Right, the after his kind protocol.
Exactly. A seed isn't just a plant part. It's a self-extracting code that ensures the system can replicate. Then the sun, moon, and stars are positioned. He says this is the installation of Kepler's laws of planetary motion. They act as the literal physical gears of the timeline's clock.
Which brings us to days 5 and 6, where the environment gets populated. When the text talks about birds flying and fish swimming, Grisel connects this to the Navier-Stokes equations.
Okay, unpack Navier-Stokes for us, because that sounds like advanced calculus.
Well, it is advanced calculus. The Navier-Stokes equations dictate how fluids and gases move. It's the math that explains why a bird's wing generates lift, or how a fish's fin pushes through water.
Right.
Grisel's point is that the biblical text isn't just saying God made birds. It's claiming the system booted up the exact complex fluid dynamics required for biological flight to even exist. And then comes the culmination of the boot sequence.
The creation of Adam.
Exactly.
But the author notes Adam isn't created as a helpless baby. He's created as a fully formed adult, exactly 30 years old, on a Friday, September 11, 4004 BCE. And Adam immediately starts naming the animals. Now, why is naming things so important to a system architect?
Because of the quantum observer effect.
Okay, explain that.
In quantum mechanics, a system remains in a state of superposition until it is observed. Adam is the system's conscious observer. By naming the animals, he categorizes them. His conscious observation anchors the reality of the biosphere, giving order to the system.
I love the pink elephant analogy he uses here.
Oh, that's a great one.
He says, if a physicist looks at the origin of the universe, they say Big Bang. If a creationist looks at it, they say, let there be light. The problem is they spend all their time arguing, not realizing they are just sitting in different seats in the exact same room looking at the same pink elephant.
Exactly. It's the exact same physical event, just described from different observer positions.
That analogy bridges the gap between theology and astrophysics brilliantly. And it brings us to day 7, the Sabbath. In Grizzle's framework, this isn't the architect needing a nap.
No, definitely not.
This is the system reaching perfect thermodynamic equilibrium. The construction is finished, the code is compiled, the observer is online, and the environment is perfectly stable.
But here's the catch. If the system is perfectly stable, why does it crash? We have perfect equilibrium, which means nothing changes unless a user input forces a change.
Enter the fall of man.
Right, because according to Grizzle, Adam doesn't just wake up on day 8 and immediately eat the forbidden fruit.
Ah.
He actually spends 30 years in the Garden of Eden.
Wait, 30 years? But the timeline?
But he is operating under severe time dilation. Drawing on the scriptural concept that one day is as 1,000 years, the author applies the physics of relativity.
Oh, wow.
He calculates that Adam's 30 years in the localized reference frame of Eden equate to nearly 11 million years in the Earth's broader reference frame.
That is brilliant. It solves the chronological problem of the fossil record and the age of the Earth. It gave Adam millions of Earth years to observe and name every species.
Exactly. But then Adam interacts with the one piece of code he was told to leave alone.
Right. Sunday, September 11, 3974 BCE. This is FTN1, fall day number 1.
The moment he eats the fruit, he triggers the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy is unleashed into the system. Perfect equilibrium is destroyed, and the system begins to decay.
The arrow of time is released, and it points strictly forward toward death. The one-to-one mortal clock officially begins ticking.
And the author's metaphor for the tree of knowledge of good and evil is incredibly sharp here. He compares it to a Venus flytrap.
Oh, right, the flytrap.
Yeah, to a fly, the plant looks beautiful. It's biologically engineered to bypass the fly's logic gates. It offers sweet nectar, which looks like a massive system upgrade to the user.
Yeah.
But the moment you interact with it, the trap snaps shut.
It's the ultimate point of no return. And to hammer home what a point of no return actually feels like, he shares another harrowing story from his days as a pilot.
The Lexington flight.
Yes. He was flying blind into Lexington, Kentucky in the middle of the night with absolutely zero visibility. They'd already missed their first approach at another airport in a fog. They are running entirely on instruments, sweating bullets, and the fuel gauge is practically resting on empty.
It's terrifying.
When they finally broke through the clouds, landed in Lexington, and checked the fuel slip, they realized they had used 83 gallons out of a usable 84.
Meaning they had less than 3 minutes of flight time left before the engine simply starved and stopped.
3 minutes? I mean, when you're in the air, you can't just bill over and think about your choices.
And that's exactly why he uses the story. It shows that once you commit to a certain path, once you cross that critical threshold, the physics of the situation completely take over. You are bound by the math of your fuel tank.
Wow.
Adam made the choice to eat the fruit, and the system entered a state of irreversible momentum.
So, if entropy means the universe's health bar is now actively draining, how does the system not just crash immediately? You have humans multiplying, and without perfect equilibrium, corruption scales rapidly. How does the architect stop the whole thing from self-destructing?
Through aggressive system management. The author outlines how the architect uses catastrophic resets and isolated sandboxes to quarantine the virus of human corruption.
And the first major crash is Cain and Abel, right? FDN 47,118, the first murder.
Yeah. From a pure physics standpoint, Grizzle describes this as the first unauthorized transfer of physical momentum resulting in human death. But he poses a fascinating ontological theory about why this happens. He suggests that friction between brothers is actually a feature, not a bug in the post-fall system.
Wait, how is a brother murdering a brother a feature?
Well, not the murder itself, but the underlying friction. Think about it. If human families stayed entirely insular, perfectly happy in one single location, human intelligence and genetic diversity would stagnate.
Oh, I see.
The friction forces dispersion. He compares it to a commercial cheese plant that homogenizes milk from hundreds of different local farms to create a stronger, more consistent product. Brothers pushing each other out of the nest is the engine that distributes human ingenuity and genetics across the globe.
Wow, okay, so friction forces humanity to spread out. But even with dispersion, humanity gets completely corrupted again, leading to the ultimate system reset the flood, which he calculates down to the day. Friday, November 1st, 2316 BC.
The flood is described in structural terms as a hydrostatic pressure reset. The global system was simply too infected to save, so the architect wiped the board using fluid dynamics, preserving only a tiny 8-person remnant in an insulated vessel to protect the genetic lineage.
But apparently, wiping the board doesn't fix human nature, because just a few generations later, we get the Tower of Babel, FDN 641,733. Humanity decides to pool all its resources, ignore the dispersion protocol, and unite in rebellion. And the comparison Grisel makes here genuinely gave me chills.
The AGI comparison.
Yes, he compares the Tower of Babel to modern AGI, artificial general intelligence.
It is a highly provocative parallel. At Babel, humanity had one language, unified intent, and a shared database of knowledge. The biblical text says that because of this, nothing will be restrained from them.
Which sounds exactly like Silicon Valley right now.
Exactly. Grisel looks at our current race to build AGI and sees the exact same architectural pattern. We are trying to build a unified superintelligence, a single mind that can improve itself exponentially without constraints.
It's like we are building our own digital Tower of Babel right now. If a unified, unconstrained human intelligence triggered a massive divine intervention and a language scramble back then, what happens when we create a machine superintelligence that literally knows everything? It's a terrifying thought.
It really raises profound questions about the limits of human ambition. But returning to the timeline, after scattering humanity at Babel to slow down their technological compounding, the architect still needs to protect the specific lineage that will eventually lead to the Messiah.
Right, the timeline has to be preserved.
Exactly, and this introduces the concept of the Egyptian sandbox.
Right, because if you leave a small family wandering the desert, they either die out or assimilate into other cultures, and their exact chronological records get lost.
Precisely. In software development, a sandbox is an isolated, tightly controlled testing environment where code can run, multiply, and be observed safely without being corrupted by the outside system. God places the nation of Israel in Egypt for exactly 430 years. They go in as a vulnerable family of 70 people, and they come out 430 years later as a massive, unified nation of millions.
And it's not just about population growth, is it? It's about mathematical preservation. Because they are culturally isolated in Goshen, they don't adopt the Egyptian calendar or their religious days. That 430-year isolation acts as a massive checksum for the timeline, ensuring that the continuous day count and that modulo 7 math we talked about earlier doesn't drift a single inch.
And that rigid preservation allows for what the author calls the commissioning protocol.
Right.
Through all these resets, there is a mathematically rigid pattern of 30-year intervals that keeps firing like a metronome.
Let's unpack this 30-year protocol, because this is where all the math really converges. We already mentioned Adam was created at exactly age 30.
Right.
Then, using that unbroken count of days, Grisel calculates that the patriarch Abraham turns 30 on Sunday, September 11th, 1974 BCE. And then, exactly to the physical day, 2,000 years later, Jesus Christ begins his public ministry at age 30 on Sunday, September 11th, 27 CE.
The symmetry is staggering. And it's not just the 30-year marks. He knows the exactness of their conception and birth dates. According to his celestial calculations, both Abraham and Christ share a precise December 25th conception boundary, and both are born on Friday, September 11th.
It's an unbroken, recursive mathematical loop spanning millennia?
It is. And to ground all of this heavy math into something incredibly human and, well, visceral, the author shares the story of his own son, Cameron.
Oh, this story was incredible.
Cameron was born with cystic fibrosis. Doctors told the family he wasn't supposed to live past 5 years old. But he survived a double lung transplant. Then, years later, he developed a lethal stomach bezoar, a massive hardened blockage in his digestive tract. The top-tier hospital wanted to do a high-risk, open surgery that he likely wouldn't survive.
But Cameron took control of his own system.
He did. He actually fired his surgeon, did his own deep dive research, and discovered an obscure chemical solution.
And it was Coca-Cola, right?
Yes. He cured his own lethal blockage by continuously pumping Coca-Cola into his stomach through a tube until the acidity of the soda literally dissolved the bezoar.
It's an unbelievable story of medical survival.
It is, and Grisel uses Cameron's life to illustrate what he calls the creation pattern, moving from non-being to being, facing near death, and achieving re-being. He argues that resurrection, survival against mathematically impossible odds, isn't just a spiritual concept. It is literally built into the physical architecture of the universe's code.
So if we pull all of this together, Grizel is arguing that the biblical timeline simply cannot be a collection of oral traditions or historical myths. He actually calculates the mathematical probability of all these dates, weekdays, planetary alignments, and 30-year intervals aligning by random, unguided chance.
Yeah, and using the modulus 7 math constraints, he arrives at a probability of 1 in 9.39 sextillion.
1 in 9.39 sextillion. I honestly can't even visualize a number that big.
To put it in context, that is a 9 followed by 21 zeros. It is a mathematical argument that the parameters of this historical timeline are so tight they simply do not allow for alternative interpretations. And that rigid precision brings us to the ultimate endpoint of the author's calculations.
The target, the countdown. Because
Yeah.
if you count exactly 6,000 years, which the author equates to 120 biblical jubilees starting from FDN 1, the day Adam fell and entropy began, the timeline terminates on Sunday, September 11, 2027.
That is the exact date the author claims the 6,000-year mortal arc concludes. From a Sunday in 3974 BCE to a Sunday in 2027 CE, the math simply stops.
It is an absolutely incredible journey. We started with let there be light as the physical installation of the speed of light. We moved through fluid dynamics, the thermodynamics of the fall of man, terrifying aviation disasters, and ancient spiritual genealogies, all woven together into one unyielding mathematical equation.
It really is a lot to take in.
It is. And again, to be perfectly clear to you listening, we remain impartial observers. We aren't here to tell you to sell your house because September 11, 2027 is the end of the world. But the sheer scale, the intricate, interlocking complexity of the intellectual architecture this author has built is undeniable.
It completely forces you to look at ancient texts through an entirely different lens. Not as vague poetry, but as precision engineering.
So I want you to think about your own attitude indicator, that gyroscope instrument that pilots use when they're flying blind through a storm. When the horizon completely disappears in your own life, when you're in the thick of the ice storm and the throttles are freezing, what instruments do you actually trust to keep your wings level?
That is the vital question, because navigating the unknown always requires trusting a system outside of your own perception.
Absolutely. And I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, assuming this entire hypothesis is true. If time truly is a strictly coded, mathematically verifiable 6,000-year countdown, if it's really a countdown, what happens to human free will?
That's the paradox, isn't it?
Yeah. Are we all simply agents acting out a pre-compiled script, reading lines that were written into the code at the dawn of time? Or does our conscious observation, the choices we make when the fuel gauge is resting on empty, actually steer the ship within those rigid boundaries?
It is the ultimate tension between the rigid constraints of the code and the agency of the user.
Next time you look at a history book, ask yourself, is this just a watercolor painting of the past, or are you staring at a countdown clock?